Making an awesome user interface is getting easier and easier with things like the Ionic framework, used in combination with popular platforms like React, Angular and Vue. Flutter is also an increasingly popular choice. Often, just the basics of these technologies are enough to produce something quite impressive. However, making a beautiful UI is something that requires ultra fine-grained control. In Angular-based applications, this can be achieved in large part using directives, which allow you to manipulate and extend the default functionalities of DOM elements. Let's make a simple directive that transforms a regular div into a divider. In a new file called Directives, using Angular snippets on your keyboard, create a basic Angular directive. Alternatively, you can type it. Inside the decorator, set the selector to divider. Give the class a constructor and inject element ref. We're also going to need ng after content init. Declaring it with the implement syntax is optional, but good practice. In Angular, lifecycle hooks get called even if they're not declared. Then we're going to call native element on the element ref instance, which gives us access to whichever element this directive has been placed on. For a basic divider, we simply set the vertical margin to 32 pixels and the horizontal to automatic, which will center the divider. To test it, we have repeated paragraphs of lorem ipsum. The styling is also basic. Note that it doesn't include any dividing styles. Then import the directive in that pages module. Before we add the directive, let's see what it looks like. If only there was some space between those paragraphs, eh? Well, back in the HTML, add a div element with the divider attribute. This attribute is the same name we gave to our directive via the selector property in the directive. It can be anything you want. Save and recompile, and now we'll see the directive in action. Nice. That is the most basic use case for a directive. Let's next make a directive that observes the user for basic actions like copy and pasting, right-clicking and hovering over elements. We'll appropriately call it the Big Brother directive. Instead of writing multiple directives, we can simply tell this directive which action to look for. We do this by setting a property on the directive and prefixing it with the input decorator, which tells Angular to expect a value to be set here. We're also going to set an optional property called element, in case we want to explicitly tell Big Brother which element it is being set on. A dispose listener property will allow us to correctly stop the listener once the user changes the page. We will interact with the user using toast, so let's set some default options, like the color, position, and duration. In the constructor, inject the renderer, element ref, and toast controller. Then inside after content init, we build the listener. To the dispose listener property, we assign a listener. Call listen on the renderer and pass it the host element, the action requested, and a method to execute once the action is observed. Then within ng on destroy, we dispose of the listener. To understand how this will work, let's first add it to an HTML element. Before that, tidy up the page with some additional dividers. Nothing is more comforting than knowing where the Big Brother is watching. We employ the directive just like with the divider, by adding it to an element. We can pass our action in by setting the attribute. You might think that we need to explicitly set action here, like so, but by setting Big Brother as the selector of the input decorator, it allows us to do this shorthand syntax. Angular is smart enough to know what we're trying to do. Back in the directive, set some variables that we're going to change conditionally on the toast. Then create the toast instance and merge in the variables. Write a switch statement for each action, and change the toast message, and if you want, color and the duration. Calling prevent default on the actions event is necessary only for actions we want to disable. Then we add the directives to the HTML elements. Copy, opening the context menu, and double click, each on separate elements. Make sure the directive is included in the page module and compile the app. First we have our hover action. And if we attempt to copy or to open the context menu with a right click, or when we double click, we get the warnings. Now let's try something for input fields. Back in the directive, add a case for focus and blur. In the HTML, for the paste action, add a group of inputs and assign the directive to a parent div. For copy and blur, assign the attribute to the input element and set the directive's element property with element equals input. Now if we copy the lorem and try to paste it to the input, we get this error and distinct messages for focus and blur. Pretty cool, huh? Another thing we can do here is add new elements to the DOM. A good idea here would be to add a Big Brother eye to elements that are observed by Big Brother, to indicate to the user, of course. In the directive, create a new property called secret and set it to false. Then above the listener, but still inside after content init, we check if Big Brother should be watching in secret. If not, we first check what kind of element we're dealing with. If it has child nodes, it's likely a div element, in which case we can add our element just before the div closes. This obviously won't work with input elements, so for them we place the HTML after the element. The element we're going to insert is a basic iron icon. Finally, let's make a few elements secret, which will ensure that the eye doesn't show. Run the code, and there it is. The final thing we're going to do is look at animations. Nothing would make this web page more perfect than an animation on the double click warning. So let's do that. Jump back into the app and install Angular Animations. And add Browser Animations module to the app module imports. At the top of the directive file, import Animation Builder, Animate, Styles and Keyframes from Angular Animations. Angular Animations are a topic worthy of their own course. Here we're not going to go too deep into the technicalities, so if you get stuck with any of the concepts, the Angular documentation is brilliant, albeit dense. Let's inject the builder, then create a player property to which we assign an instance of the builder. Here is where our animations live. The first argument is a starting style. For our double-click lorem element, a simple red outline and zoom effect will be the first animation. The next will be a reversal of the zoom, and so on. The final style will be to restore the element to its beginning state. On the player we call the create method and pass the element. We don't want animation on every element, so let's create an animation property and set it to a default of false. Then in after content init, we say if animation is true, play the animation. Finally, we set the animation property on our element to true. And there's our effect. If we wanted to make the animation faster, we simply change the animate duration, like so. So there you have it, a most basic but insightful introduction into the utility of Angular directives. On the one hand, directives decomplicate code by increasing modularity and allowing large blocks of HTML and event listener code to be compressed into 1 or 2 words. And on the other hand, they give you remarkable control over the user experience.